I've got a photo I want to show you just to start. If we can just get that up, it's I know, it's like, I don't know if you've ever had this experience before, but getting slapped in the face with a cow's tongue, obviously she doesn't look like she's enjoying it that much. And there's a way to avoid that. Don't get so close. I don't know if you noticed, there's actually a fence between her and the cow. Fences have a purpose. Now, I only have one purpose this morning, and that is that when we leave here today, or if you're watching online, I want you to be able to have a sense that I can strengthen the relationships in my life in all levels through understanding how Jesus modelled relationships, how there's an old saying farmers have, and I think that might even help you. And I'm going to share a little bit of a revelation that David had, that he wrote about in Psalm 16. So we're going to go this morning to one place, and that's to help build the relationships in our life. Now, just a warning about Jesus. When we look at Jesus to glean stuff, to learn stuff, he did some strange things. Like, if you're not sure about that, read how he bumps into a blind guy and he makes a mud pack for his eyes. He already couldn't see, but Jesus makes a mud pack by spitting into the dry ground and making mud. I don't know if you've ever thought how much spit it takes to make mud out of dry, dusty Israeli soil. And the guy's blind, but he's not deaf. He can hear the noises. And then it's slap. And then it's go wash this stuff off. But through that man got to see. And sometimes some of the things that Jesus did are a little strange. He even said strange things like, if anyone has ears, let him hear. Well, most people have ears, but we don't all listen to understand, and I think that's what Jesus was encouraging us to do, and that's my heart's cry this morning, because I worked out a long time ago that if the only thing I learn each day comes out of this mouth, I'm in strife. So this morning, I just encourage us to have a little lean into what is going on, and don't assume you know everything there is to know about relationships. 2 weeks ago, I mentioned how physically we have this capacity to maintain balance by 3 systems that are in our body. It's our inner ear, it's our skin, and it's our eyesight. And they all operate automatically. And only when they're not working are we sort of aware that I need these things to maintain balance. Now, last week, when Kerry and Steve finished their vows to each other, they snuck in a little kiss. I don't know if you saw that little moment. I didn't even have to say, you may now kiss that. She was into it, right? Now, fortunately, saliva is the first line of defence against nasty bacteria like boy germs and girl germs, and they weren't even thinking about that. Because, see, just like balance, strategically operating all the time, God has put these systems in place that we're not even aware of. You don't have to think about it. We're not even conscious. But trying to find balance in our personal relationships, in all the different areas it's tricky. And there's no automatic system that will protect our fragile self from being hurt in relationships or hurting other people emotionally, mentally, spiritually. We were part of a church startup in Sydney and have been going a few years, and I got a phone call about 9 o'clock one night, and it was from one of the leaders in the church, and he rings up and he says, we're trying to raise this money for this to pay the building, and we can't make the repayments this week. Can you give us $1,000? And he was ringing everyone up in the life of the church. And I said, I don't have $1,000. He said, well, put it on your credit card. And he was really pushy. And I was starting to feel really ticked off because I knew that he was ringing everyone, and I could say no, but I knew some people wouldn't. They're too nice. They're kind-hearted, much more kind-hearted, much more generous than me. And there would be people that would be guilted and manipulated and pushed into giving this night. And I wasn't happy. And if you have been hurt in church life, if you've been put off church by what people have done or what they've said, it's usually not because the person was a bad person. It's because they were put in the wrong position. Wrong person, wrong position. And it makes them look like a bad person. And that applies in every area of church life. It includes church pastors, home group leaders, any area of influence in the life of the church. If you put it wrong person, wrong position, people get hurt. Now, the guy that rang me that night was a good guy, a generous-hearted man. But he was asked to do something by the senior pastor that I felt violated one of God's systems to help us do relationships well. And God has these relational systems, and even if we ignore them or we choose to go against them, we get hurt. People get hurt. Friends become just someone you used to know. And people pull back from village life, from churches, and they may keep their relationship with Jesus intact, but what happens to the next generation, that's problematic. And we know what happens in marriages when people cross those areas where they weren't meant to, where relational systems get violated and marriages come apart. I've heard people say that the Bible is like a owner's manual for your car. I don't think that's actually true. Because if you are driving along in your car and one of those funny little symbols comes on in the dashboard, a little flashing light or a little starry thing or an engine-shaped thing, whatever, if you stop and have a look in your manual, turn to page 16 or 24, whatever it is, it will tell you what that symbol means and what you're to do and why it's a problem or not. But the Bible doesn't work that way. It's a book of stories. And within those stories are everything we need for relational strength, relational success, relational systems. We find them. And I want to show you this morning one system that God has for us when it comes to relationships. Can we put that video up? Thanks. Here, dogs. This is one of God's systems. What did you just see then? A dog jumping a fence, right? A couple of dogs jumping a fence. Why did they jump the fence? Because it was there, Jeff says. Exactly, they can't get through that fence. They couldn't get through that fence, so they had to jump it. One more video.
Brindle, up. Up.
So I don't know if you noticed that in the first video, that fence was a netting fence. It was an older type fence. And in the last video, when the big dog jumped the fence and the pups are on this side of the fence, that's a much newer fence. It's a ring lock fence and has one hot wire along it for those very sharp people that notice that, right? But what you don't know is those two fences are the boundary fences on our property. And if you go back a few years, that last fence you saw, the dog jumping over, that fence was very, very broken down. And the neighbours' cows used to just walk sort of through it. And my goats used to walk through it into his place. And that did not always help relationships between me and my neighbour. There's an old saying that farmers have, and it's that good fences make good neighbours. And I've never thought to myself, when I look over the fence, I wonder if my neighbour's drenched his cows. But when I've looked inside my boundary and I've seen my own goats, I've thought, I think I need to drench those. See, just a few bits of wire and some fence posts tells me where my responsibilities begin and tells me where my neighbour's responsibilities begin. And fences, they're boundary lines. Like, I know, Paul, you've been doing a lot of fencing lately, lots of fencing. And there's a purpose for it, right? And I didn't have to put up that new boundary fence, and my neighbour didn't build it. We paid a fencing contractor, someone like Paul, to build the thing for us. But fences, they don't exist just automatically. But every farm has a boundary fence. But not every friendship, not every marriage has wire and posts all in the right places. In fact, for some of you, you've never had very good boundary fences in your relationships, or over time, they've just sort of fallen down, got neglected. And if good fences make good neighbours, good boundaries make good relationships. You didn't have to come up with a recipe for saliva. You didn't have to come up with a way for your body to automatically balance itself. God did all of that. But when it comes to establishing fence lines, where do the posts go in? Where does the wire go relationally in our life? We're the only one that can determine that. So how do we do that? Well, when David discovered the answer to that, he wrote this in Psalm 16, and it's verses 6 and 7. I'm just going to read it to you. The boundary lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. Surely I have a delightful inheritance. He's talking about his future. I'll praise the Lord who counsels me. Even at night, my heart instructs me. David found God's help, God's instructions, God's counsel when it came to understanding this. See, property lines, they define ownership, where you end and where someone else begins. And for David, God's boundary lines fell in, he described them in pleasant places. This is me, that's you. This is what I'm in control of, that's what you're in control of. That's my responsibility, that's yours. Now, Coral basically never ever feeds my dogs. That's my responsibility. If I'm away, she looks after them, but when I'm home, she never has to think about them. That's my job. That's my responsibility. I never ring Jeff or text Jeff after 9 o'clock at night, unless it's an emergency, because that's something I understand that's important to Jeff, because he gets up very early and goes to bed early. But where I struggle in village life is when people come to me in need. And I don't want to be a professional pastor. I don't like being called pastor, because it's like it separates me and I'm just one of us. And I don't want to be the sort of person that can't be contacted, that has a Mondays off and you can't contact me and you have to come through emails, and I don't want to be that person. And in the past, I discovered that sort of way of doing life could become problematic for me, because when I played a role with Teen Challenge and we were assessing people going into Teen Challenge, I remember a mum came desperate to me, and her daughter was about 23. She was a heroin addict. She was prostituting herself. And I met with the daughter, and she wasn't keen. Teen Challenge deals with life-controlling issues. They had a farm set up at Kyabram, and we're trying to get her there. And she wasn't that keen to go. And she wasn't desperate, but the mother was. The mother said to me, if you don't get her there, she's going to die. So I did all I could to get her there. She lasted 2 days, and then she walked away. She never went back. And I realised that I'm fighting more for her life than she was willing to fight for her own life. And I was in her paddock, and it wasn't my responsibility. And I sort of learnt that lesson, but in the last 12 months, I've let some boundaries down, some fences down, and I've found myself really consumed with caring for one individual person. Now, in life, we all have a family of origin, and that family of origin helps to set up our understanding what boundaries look like, what fences look like. And so I grew up with stories of my grandparents and my grandfather, who was a Methodist minister. He would give away everything he owned other than the shirt on his back. Literally, he would have one shirt, one good shirt, because he'd give it away to someone in need. One pair of shoes. They would go without a meal to serve, to give someone who was homeless that knocked on their door. I grew up with that as the folklore in my family. And then I saw my mum and dad just serving and serving and serving people. And mum would sacrifice everything for someone else. And so that set me up with boundary lines that were a bit blurred. And in this last 12 months, I felt like I was fighting for someone's life. And it meant that I spent hours upon hours upon hours texting back and forward, trying to help this person. And I even got to a place where I slept with my phone under my pillow so that when they text me, any time of the night, I would answer it, and I'd spend hours going back and forward. Now, that person came into my life with great needs. They were broken and fragile and weak, and yet over time, they became controlling over my time. They had power over everything I was doing. And it meant that I wasn't able to give you the energy and time that I was giving this person. And here's the thing, it wasn't their fault. I was responsible for where the fence lines should be. I was responsible, not them. I was responsible. See, I know I can't be everyone's friend, and I don't try to be. I'd like to be, but I know I can't. But there's something in me that wants to never give up on someone, never wants to let you down, wants to keep believing in you and keep going. And I'm not going to walk away from this. That might be good, but it's set me up for being vulnerable in this area. And so Jesus shows us how to navigate this, because he had the crowd, and then he had the 120, that was his church that he left behind. He had the 72 that he sent out. He had the 12. He had the 3, Peter, James and John, his closest friends. The reason those numbers are there is because they are circles. A big circle, the crowd. A smaller crowd, the 72. The 12. It's getting smaller. And the reason the numbers can be there is because Jesus identified different groups of people, and he had boundary fences around them that separate them. And even with Peter, James and John, it came down to just John was his closest. Now, of the 3, Peter, James and John, Jesus' closest friends, what do you know about John? What do you know about James? Nothing. We almost know nothing about James. But if you want to look into the Bible and find teaching on close friendship, on loving one another, of relational connection, it's John. John is the one that teaches us that, not Matthew, not Peter, not Paul, John, because see, John, he had this capacity that was different to the other three close friends. He had a capacity to go deep relationally. In fact, Coral and I were driving back to Sydney one time and we got behind this big Kombi van, and on the back of it, it said, Jesus loves you, but I'm his favourite. And I think that was John's van they stole, because that's how John lived life. He felt like he was the closest, and he was. And on the cross, it was to John that Jesus said, Mum, here's your son. John, I want you to care for Mum. Because he had that relational capacity that the others didn't. Like Peter, he didn't have the same emotional IQ that John had. And Jesus knew that, and he had these boundary fences around these individual people so that it didn't become traumatic for the people involved. See, friends share experiences together, you look after each other, and friends create memories. And if you were to ask Jesus about one of his most precious memories with his time on earth, I reckon he would take you to the day when he asked his disciples, who do people say I am? And they gave an answer. And they said, but who do you say I am? And Peter goes, Jesus, pick me. Jesus, you're the Son of God. And when he said, you're the Messiah, the Son of the living God, that was a really precious, significant moment in Jesus' life. If you were to ask Peter, one of the special memories he had as being Jesus' close friends, and then you switched it and you said, don't tell us your best memory, tell us one of your most painful memories, he would take you to that same day. But it was later in the day. Later, after Jesus had shared that he was going to go to the cross, what was going to happen to him at the hands of the leaders, and that he would rise from the dead on the third day. He shared all that. And after he shared that, Peter took him aside. Now, the King James and the NIV both use the same word. And they say, Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. The word actually means forbid. But he didn't rebuke Jesus in the way that we think, like he told him off. Jesus, you naughty. No. We know what he said. And this is what he said. No, never, Lord, shall this ever happen to you. And then in the narrative it says Jesus turned to him. Turned, Jesus spun around. That's what it means. He spun around and he said, get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. Ouch. I reckon that hurt. Peter wasn't expecting that response. He's trying to protect Jesus as a friend, and Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. You're a stumbling block to me. Who deep down thinks that Jesus overreacted that day? I think he did. And because Peter was just trying to do something nice like a friend should do, surely. Why did Jesus have such a strong reaction to what Peter just said? Because Peter had just jumped the fence and started drenching Jesus' cows. Jesus didn't ask him to do that. Jesus asked the disciples, who do people say I am? But he didn't ask them, should I be going to the cross? He didn't ask Peter for his advice. See, fences between neighbours, they're visible. But boundaries between friends, in marriages, between parents and your kids, with your workmates, they're not always so well defined, are they? So Jesus went on to explain to Peter why he reacted like that. And he says, you are seeing things merely from a human point of view, not from God's. See, Peter didn't have the capacity to see past the cross to the other side. And his advice was a hindrance. And the reason he didn't have that capacity is because only Jesus had that capacity, because only Jesus was asked by God to go the cross. It was inside his property lines. And the writer of Hebrews tells us that Jesus endured the cross for the joy set before him. He had an understanding that Peter didn't. And later when Jesus recommissioned Peter, after Peter had failed Jesus multiple times, Jesus then told Peter, if you follow me, you're also going to die, be crucified in a way that you would not want to have happen to you. And at that moment, Peter didn't say, no, never. He just quietly accepted that. See, God only pays for what he orders. And inside your property lines, inside your life, if God has called you to do something, he will give you all that's needed. And that's on a deep spiritual level, but it applies on every human level. In daily life, if we don't understand the importance of boundary lines, it causes so much grief. When we were part of that church plant in Sydney, there was a family that were very well off financially, but they couldn't have children. So they adopted 2 boys. And I got to know the family very well. But the dad had a favourite of the 2 boys. The oldest boy was definitely not his favourite. The youngest boy was his favourite. And it was so obvious to everyone. And it was causing friction between the 2 boys, competing with each other. And I could see it. It was so obvious. But I couldn't say anything. All we could do was watch and see this coming out in their lives. And eventually, when the oldest boy was a teenager, he's no longer living at home. He's living on the streets in Sydney. He's an ice addict. And I remember one night he knocked on our door asking if he could sleep on our couch because he had nowhere to sleep. If I turned my page, I'd know what I'm up to, wouldn't I? I want to finish with this thought. You may think you're really good at saying no to people, that you've got really good, strong boundaries in place. But good property lines also have gates in the front fence to invite the right people in. And if that mum and that dad of those 2 boys had invited Coral and I to step into their parenting world, if they'd sought someone else's outside advice that could be helpful, things would have been very different. But see, if I had spoken up, unasked for advice always feels like criticism. And all I would have got is defensiveness and anger, and I had no right because that was in their boundary lines. That was their responsibility to parent those kids. We just couldn't go in and we just saw it unfold. In your life, you might only have a few fence posts that are falling down a little bit and a few wires that need straining up. Or your boundary fences might be lying flat on the ground and the neighbour's cows eating all your grass. Those are just the facts. The truth is that if you can echo the words of David when he said, "The boundary lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. Surely I have a delightful inheritance. I'll praise the Lord who counsels me. Even at night, my heart instructs me." If you can say that with hand on heart, if that's your experience, you will go through into relational strength no matter where you are now. And I think the secret is not making huge, big changes. It's little increments. And next week, I'm going to look at why people struggle when you suddenly put up a new fence. And suddenly you put new boundaries up and they go, whoa, that hasn't been there before. There are ways to do this. And we're going to build upon this more next week, but I'd encourage you, if there's stuff that's lying flat on the ground and you think, I really don't have a boundary in that area, we're going to be looking at that and how you can do it just little bits at a time. I think sometimes in life we underestimate the power of little bits and we overestimate what we can do in a short time. So we're going to continue that next week. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for all those online. And Philip, would you like to come and test your seat? Last week this seat collapsed on Philip and he got actually quite injured. He's got a new one coming. It has a greater seating capacity in kilos. What are you doing up there, Philip? Nothing. I don't know what he's doing behind my back, and because he's naturally a naughty child, you just never know what's going on. So I'll leave it up to you guys. But just really appreciate the opportunity to speak into your lives and try and paint a little picture of where God wants to take us.